July 5, 1982. Estadio de Sarria, Barcelona. A hot Spanish afternoon, the kind where the light turns everything amber and the shadows on the pitch are long and sharp. 90 minutes from now, one of the greatest football teams ever assembled will be on a plane home. But right now, as the players walk out of the tunnel, the crowd inside this small, compact stadium falls quiet with something close to reverence. It had taken Brazil 2 years to build what they had. In 1980, a coach named Tele Santana was handed the national team with a simple brief: play like Brazil again. The previous 2 World Cup campaigns had been technically competent and completely joyless, the legacy of a post-Pelé era in which results had been prioritized over everything else. Santana rejected that inheritance entirely. What he built instead was something the football world had not seen since 1970. A team that passed the ball as if the act of passing were itself the point, not a means to an end but an end in itself. A team where no player held the ball for more than 2 touches before it was moving again, flowing through lines of defenders like water around stone. In a European tour in May 1981, they beat England, France, and Germany within a matter of days. The football press ran out of superlatives. At the heart of it were 3 men who could each have been the best player at any other World Cup. Zico, the Flamengo playmaker they called the White Pelé, operating just behind the strikers with a first touch so soft it seemed to defy physics. Falcao, the Roma midfielder, deep and commanding, reading the game 3 passes ahead of everyone else. And Socrates, the doctor. A man who held a medical degree, read philosophy, and ran a football club democratically, who was also, when the ball reached him at his left foot, capable of producing moments of such sudden, startling beauty that even his opponents stopped to watch. In the streets of Rio and Sao Paulo, bunting went up in the weeks before Spain as if for a coronation. Everyone, from the military generals running the country to the children playing barefoot on the beach, agreed this was Brazil's year. This was the year football became beautiful again. To understand what this team meant, you have to understand what Brazil was in 1982. The military regime that had seized power in 1964 was still in place, though weakening. General Figueiredo had taken the presidency in 1979 with a promise of a gradual return to democracy, but the economy was collapsing, inflation was spiraling, unemployment was rising, and a population that had been promised prosperity in exchange for its political freedom was beginning to ask, loudly, what it had given its freedom for. Into that atmosphere, football arrived not merely as entertainment but as something closer to collective therapy. Brazil's players were, in 1982, still mostly playing their club football at home. You might genuinely bump into Zico at a Rio supermarket, spot Socrates at a cafe in Sao Paulo. They were not distant icons behind sponsors' fences. They were neighbors. The relationship between this team and its people was intimate in a way that modern football makes almost impossible to imagine. And Socrates, who had been a political activist long before he was famous, understood exactly what this team represented. He and several of his Corinthians club colleagues had established a radical experiment called Corinthians democracy. The players voted on transfers, on wages, on everything. The club was run collectively. In the Brazil of 1982, that was not just a football story. It was a political one. When Santana gathered his squad and told them their commitment was to attack, to express themselves, to play without fear, he was not merely giving a tactical instruction. He was making a philosophical statement about the kind of football, and by extension the kind of country, worth believing in. Zico remembered it years later with the clarity of something that still mattered. We wanted to enjoy what we were doing, he said. We felt that something really special was going on. That feeling, fragile and extraordinary, lasted until the afternoon of July 5th. Then Rossi had 3 touches, and the feeling was gone. On the other side of the bracket was an Italy side that almost nobody, including their own supporters, believed in. Italy had drawn all 3 of their first-round matches, scraping through a group containing Poland, Cameroon, and Peru. The Italian press had been merciless. Supporters had turned. Manager Enzo Bearzot, a stubborn, proud man who rarely spoke to journalists, instituted a full media blackout. His players would not speak to the press for the rest of the tournament. The siege mentality was total. At the center of Italy's problems was a striker named Paolo Rossi. In 1980, Rossi had been caught up in a match-fixing scandal that earned him a 2-year ban from football. When Bearzot included him in the 1982 squad, it was an act of loyalty that most of Italy considered either brave or foolish or both. Rossi had barely played. He was ring-rusty, visibly uncertain, and after 3 group games he had not scored a single goal. He looked, by his own later admission, like a man learning to play football again from scratch. What nobody outside the Italian camp had seen was what Bearzot had seen in training, a player who had spent 2 years in enforced exile thinking of nothing but football, who understood space and movement at a level that had not been diminished by inactivity but somehow sharpened by it. A man, in other words, who was ready to do something extraordinary, who just needed a stage large enough to do it on. When Italy beat Argentina 2-1 in the second group stage, the mood changed. When Brazil then destroyed Argentina 3-1, the stage was set. A Brazil team playing football that looked like art against an Italian side that had rediscovered something cold and efficient and very, very dangerous. July 5th, Estadio de Sarria. The whole world watching. In the Brazil dressing room the night before, some of the players were already discussing Poland, the opponents waiting in the semifinals. They would only need a draw to advance on goal difference. Nobody was saying this out loud, but it was in the room.
Much of the crowd had not yet found their seats when it happened.
5 minutes. Cabrini, the Italian left-back whom Falcao had warned his teammates about in the pre-match meeting, the one they hadn't fully listened to, whipped a cross into the Brazilian penalty area. It was a delivery with pace and curl and precise, deliberate intent. Paolo Rossi arrived at the near post a fraction of a second before the goalkeeper and headed it cleanly into the net. Italy 1, Brazil 0. 5 minutes gone. Rossi had his first goal of the tournament. In the Brazilian half, nobody panicked. This was a team that had been in difficult moments before and played their way out of them with football. 12 minutes later, Socrates received the ball on the edge of the Italian penalty area, looked up once, and drove it into the corner of the net with his left foot. 1-1. The Estadio de Sarria exhaled. This was going to be a game. It was. It was a game in which everything that was beautiful about Brazil and everything that was ruthless about Italy was on full display simultaneously, not taking turns, but happening at the same moment. 2 different philosophies of football occupying the same pitch at the same time. Brazil probed and moved and created. Italy absorbed and waited and struck. In the 25th minute, a Brazilian defender played a loose ball across his own backline. It was the kind of error that happens once in 50 games, the kind that good teams punish and great teams destroy. Rossi was onto it before the thought had finished forming. He scored his second. Italy 2-1. In the stands, Brazilian supporters who had arrived ready to celebrate were going quiet. On the pitch, their team kept playing. That was the instruction. That had always been the instruction. Attack. Express. Trust the football. Santana had never told them to hold back. And so they didn't. They played on, and they were beautiful, and it was not enough. The 68th minute. Brazil 2-1 down. 22 minutes left to save the tournament. Falcao received the ball 30 yards from goal, turned onto his right foot, and hit it. Not a placement shot. Not a tap-in. A full, committed, driven strike that flew past the goalkeeper before he had finished his dive. 2-2. The Brazilian bench erupted. The players swarmed Falcao. And then came the celebration, not the raised arms or the sprint to the corner flag, but something rawer than that. Falcao later admitted he had nearly choked on his chewing gum in the urgency and violence of the moment. The scream that came out of him was not just joy. It was relief. It was the release of 68 minutes of accumulated anxiety, of watching his team play magnificently and still fall behind. of knowing that everything they had built over 2 years was balanced on a knife edge in a hot stadium in Barcelona. At 2-2, Brazil needed only to hold on for 22 minutes. The goal difference meant a draw was enough. Santana could have told his players to manage the game, to keep the ball, to protect what they had. He didn't. And even if he had, it is not clear they would have known how. This team had been built, consciously and deliberately, without that gear. They had practiced attack and expression and flowing movement. They had not practiced safety. So they went for the win. Because that was what they were. Because that was what they had promised their people they would always be. And with 16 minutes left, from an Italian corner won against the run of play, and the kind of accidental moment that changes the direction of sporting history, Paolo Rossi was there again. His third goal. Italy 3-2. A hat-trick for a man who had arrived in Spain unable to buy a goal. 3 touches in a match. 3 goals. 3 moments that ended something. The Israeli referee, Abraham Klein, wrongly disallowed a subsequent Italian goal for offside and then blew his whistle for full time. Italy went on to beat Poland and West Germany to win the tournament. Paolo Rossi took home the Golden Boot. He died in 2020 at the age of 64. His 3 goals that afternoon in Barcelona remain some of the most consequential in World Cup history.
22 years later, a pub in Garforth, West Yorkshire, November 2004.
Socrates had come to England for the strangest of reasons, a brief promotional cameo for a non-league club called Garforth Town, a gesture so absurd and so perfectly him that journalists had flown in from across the world to write about it. A Brazilian football legend, holder of a medical degree, practitioner of radical democracy, turning out for a team in the 7th tier of the English football pyramid. After the publicity was done, the cameras gone and the notepad put away, he sat at a table in a local pub with a pint glass and talked about football the way people talk about it when they have stopped performing. With simplicity. With honesty. With the kind of clarity that only comes to people who have thought very carefully about something for a very long time. He was asked about 1982. About Italy. About Sarria. He was quiet for a moment, then said he had never watched the match back. Not once. Not any of it. 22 years, and he had not been able to bring himself to sit down and watch those 90 minutes on a screen. I just don't need to go through that game again, he said. And then, barely raising his eyes from the glass, he said the thing that has followed that team ever since. We had a hell of a team and played with happiness. Then Rossi had 3 touches and scored a hat-trick. He paused. Football as we know it died on that day. He was right, in a way that went beyond the personal. In the years that followed the Sarria tragedy, as Brazil came to call it, the country's football shifted. It became more pragmatic. More physical. More careful. The next time Brazil won a World Cup, in 1994, they beat Italy on penalties in a final so cautious and tight it was almost unwatchable. Nobody accused them of playing with happiness. Nobody could accuse any team of that, anymore, quite in the same way, and quite with the same conviction, as the team that walked out of that tunnel in Barcelona in the summer of 1982. Socrates died in January 2011. He was 57 years old. He never did watch the game back. Perhaps he didn't need to. Perhaps he carried every second of it with him, as clearly as the first time, until the very end. They scored 12 goals in 5 matches. They conceded only twice before Sarria. They played football that grown men wept watching, that opponents stopped to admire, that a generation of children tried to imitate on dusty pitches across South America and never quite could. They lost 3-2 to a man who was still learning to play again. And the world they left behind was a smaller, more cautious, more frightened place than the one they had briefly, brilliantly, shown us was possible. Good night. And remember, some teams don't win the tournament. They win something harder and rarer and more lasting than that. They win the argument about what football is for.